Rust alphabet. The first time the sky spelled anything, I was carrying 2 cartons of paper cups from the break room to the dispatch desk, hating the way the cardboard itched my wrists. The cups were the cheap ones, stacked so thin you could feel the heat bleed through even before you poured. We had one microwave that rattled when it turned, and a fridge whose rubber gasket had a torn place that sighed whenever you opened it, like the door was stretching and didn't enjoy it. It was a slow weekday in Eldergrove, late in the summer, when the maples still behaved and the creek smelled clean if you stood upwind of the mill. I'd worked municipal maintenance long enough that the days felt stacked like pallets. Same paint spatters on the concrete where the barricades leaned. Same clipboard sitting under the radio charger, pencil tied on with twine. If you asked me what I did, I said everything no one else had time to do. Patch potholes, change out dead streetlight heads. Climb the water tower when the flutter valve stuck, mop the vestibule. After kids dragged mud in with their skate wheels, find the breaker for the flagpole light when it went odd. I had keys to rooms half the town forgot existed. There's comfort in that. Or there was. The sky outside the garage door had that paper white look you get when a storm pulls itself together over the far lots. You couldn't smell rain yet, just that warm dust a truck leaves when it idles too long. The message arrived without thunder, like someone had breathed on a window and written with a finger. Letters came forward out of the grey, pale at first, then darker as the wind shouldered them into shape. "We see you," the cloud said. I put the cups on the counter and stood with my hands on the formica. The fluorescent above me ticked in a way it only does when a ballast is about to give up. The radio scanner chattered, then cut, then chattered again. Take a thing as ordinary as a ceiling light and listen to it long enough, and you'll hear it talk. The ballasts talk more when you're alone. The garage door was halfway down because the chain jumped teeth last week, and the winch needed someone with smaller hands. I told dispatch I'd do it after lunch. Outside, traffic along the highway made that wave sound against the guardrail. No one is looking up at midday, not unless a bird drops something on their windshield. I walked to the opening and pushed my knuckles under the edge of the door and ducked into the bright. The words hung where the cumulus layered low. The strokes had a raggedness like chalk on cinder block, edges feathered out by the high breeze. They weren't pretty letters, and they weren't aiming to be. If you've ever seen a kid write in the dust on a hood and press too hard in places, not hard enough in others, that was the hand. The sentences didn't creep across. They settled and held like grit. I watched long enough for my eyes to dry. The first thought I had was chemical, always is. Some plant south of the highway burped something, or a crop duster cut too low and hit a weird thermal, or some drone program at the community college decided to get clever with skywriting and failed to tell anyone in town hall. You think like that when you fix things for a living? You walk a circle around the problem, you find a place to start. "We see you," the sky said again. "Okay," I said out loud to nobody. "You see me." Back inside, I put one cup under the coffee spout and listened to the pump cough. The machine always coughed first, then drew a steady hum, then wheezed when it settled. Every sound in that building had its routine, and I knew them better than my own. When those sounds change, you notice. That was later. For now, the coffee ran brown and thin, and steam tasted like the inside of an old thermos. 2 hours after the letters showed up, a woman from over at zoning walked across the lot with her phone held out in front of her like a passport. Her name was Tara, young, sunburned, hair in a bun that looked like it hurt, the kind of walk that says, "You don't stretch enough because who has time?" She didn't come into the garage. She stood in the door like she could keep the day from sticking to her shoes. "You seen it?" she said. I turned and stripped a glove off my left hand and wiped sweat from my neck with it, which wasn't what the glove was for, but felt right anyway. "Seen what?" She tilted the phone, and the screen flared, and I saw my own reflection for a second. A greasy shadow with a municipal logo on the chest. Then I saw the clouds and the words set into them. photographed from 3 streets over where you could see the flag at the post office and the dip of the ridge behind it. She'd framed it like a postcard. "We see you," the sky said in her picture, like it did in mine without the camera. I looked out through the door again, as if the words might have drifted to say something else while I blinked. "Probably a prank," I told her. "Kids can fly just about any damn thing now." Someone posted it on the town page. She chewed on her lip like it had a seed in it. "You think it's... I don't know." "Tell whoever asks we're checking," I said, because that's what you say. "If someone's launching something without a permit, we'll have a chat. You can do that. We can knock on a door and make a face," I said. "Most times that's enough." She smiled the way people do when they want to believe a thing and don't. "Dispatch wants to know if we should send out anything, like an advisory about, I don't know, not panicking." "People don't like advisories," I said. "Sends them to the window." "People are already at the window," she said, and laughed once, short, like maybe she surprised herself. After she left, I walked the block to the post office because that was the right angle to see the words without the garage roof cutting their bellies. The flag hung straight down on a wind you could only feel if you stood under the maple and let the leaves tell you. We get big letters sometimes when the county fair hires smoke planes to do loops over the parade, a white script that dribbles and dissolves quick as a breath. This wasn't that. This had weight. A man in a brown cap came out with a roll of stamps like coins, looked up once, flinched like he'd been called by name, hurried across. I could have stopped him and asked what he thought. People like to be asked about their own eyes. I kept mine on the sky instead, and stood until the letters thinned and then were not. That would have been the end, maybe, if it had been bored kids or a drone club with too much grant money and not enough permission. It would have been the start either way. You can't stop a start by pretending it was an end. That night, the roof of my rental creaked in its old way, and the bedroom fan clacked, and I slept with my elbow over my face because the streetlight across the alley found its way through the cheap blinds, no matter how I bent them. The fridge down the hall clicked the compressor on and off, in a rhythm I didn't realize I'd counted until I waited for it, and it did not come. There's a moment between the end of a familiar noise and the beginning of its absence where your chest feels like your shirt is wrong side out. I lay there and thought about valves and seals and whether the landlord would answer when I texted and whether I could be patient enough to let him try to fix it before I did. In the morning, I ate eggs from a pan old enough that the handle got hot. I balanced the plate on the corner of the counter where the laminate had chipped and the particle board showed through like a stale cookie. On the table was the week's receipt pile, ones from the hardware and the diner and the gas station where they give you a long strip of paper for buying chewing gum. I sort them every Friday, clip them to the copy I turn in. It's not my favorite ritual, but it has a rhythm. I like rhythms. When I stacked them this time, one in the middle had 3 words written faint in the margins, as if the printer faded there and didn't on the rest of the paper. "We see you," it said, weak as old ink. I took a breath through my mouth and put that one on the bottom. Work that day was the tower. When the aquifer wants to remind you that it can, it does it with hiss and sediment. The flow meters had been acting busy without showing their work. I drove the bucket truck to the chain link, waved at the camera in the corner like always, and clicked the padlock with the key that has a ding in it so your thumb finds it without looking. The tower isn't a pretty thing up close. The paint peels in scales that could take your finger with them if you tug wrong. The ladder cage feels like a story about safety and not its practice. I clipped in, climbed with the old iron smell in my nose, boots set careful. The whole town spread around me as I rose. Eldergrove looks decent from above, the way a lot of places do if you squint away the dumpsters and the patched roofs and the jackstraw mess behind woodpiles. You can see the creek cut the flats and the blue-grey of the mill building and the high school S new track, red like a wound with a scab forming. Halfway up, I felt the rungs vibrate with a sound that wasn't my weight. It was like the tower hummed in a key I couldn't identify, a note I could feel but not hear. Wind makes that sometimes, and so do the transformers down by the substation when they're mad about a surge. I climbed on. The hatch at the top has those hinges that will close on your hand if you trust them. I set it with the prop and rolled onto the catwalk. The horizon was a flat band of pale and darker pale. Clouds lay low, thick as foam, not moving fast, not hovering. I pulled my wrench from the bracket and knelt by the bleed, put my ear to the metal, listened for the whine of grit. The town sounded far and hard, the way things do when they come through the bones of a structure. Cars made itself into one long crush of air. Somewhere, a dog barked with no conviction. I bled a bit of water into the bucket, watched for rust in the stream. My hands smelled like wet iron and old rubber gasket. The sky puffed a breath, then settled with the quiet that comes right before you can tell it will rain later, but not now. I looked up to rest my neck, and the second message was there, already half-formed and quickening like a bruise. "We know," it said, "we know what you did." I sat back on my heels. If it had said anything else, I would have swallowed it. That one caught in my throat. I'm not a churchman. My family went when I was little to the brick place with the white cross, enough Sundays that I can still taste stale mints and see a purple ribbon bookmark and hear someone cough into a program. You grow older and you put those sounds away. But a sentence like that lays a hand on your shoulder in the old way. It gives every person who reads it a private dagger and says, "This one has your name etched." I closed the bleed and the water stuttered once like a man learning to chew. I stood and held the rail, and every place I've ever stood felt crowded in that one. Beside the old mill fence when I was 14 with a boy named Eddie who carved his name into a green picnic table and then moved away 2 towns over when his mother got tired of his father's face, in an apartment hallway with a box under my arm, leaving a woman who wanted to be left because I couldn't stop being someone she had to mother. In the storage room behind the gymnasium with a mop, hearing a coach talk to a kid in a voice that sounded too gentle to be safe, but wasn't it mine to break. Things you did and didn't do both carry weight. The sky isn't clever enough to know which one will pull you under. It just says a sentence and lets you drown yourself in its vagueness. After I came down, I signed the log in the box by the gate, and my handwriting was worse, letters sticking together like dough. The hum in my jaw from the tower followed me to the truck. I drove the long way back, under the system of lights that run the length of Maine. They shift in a pattern some engineer wrote down a long time ago, a program in a little far metal brain. Green to yellow to red, a heartbeat if the heart weren't good at compromise. On a day when nothing's wrong, I count them without meaning to. If you catch them right, you can ride green the whole way and feel like luck favors you. Today, the greens came late, or I hit them wrong. And I sat under each one and watched the cross traffic slide and the turn signals wink and tried not to look at the inch of sky you can see framed between wires. At the garage, the sign taped to the inner office window had changed. Tara must have printed a new one. She has good hands on a keyboard. The corners of her paper always line up with the edge of the tape like measuring was a hobby. The first sign yesterday had read, "No public restrooms." The second one read, "Please refrain from calling about the sky. Information will be posted as it becomes available." The letters were all caps, which is a small scream. People still called. I could hear dispatch explain, then repeat. I could tell what the question was from how the answer bent. Was it a prank? Was it safe? Safe meant a different thing to everyone. To the woman in the bungalow with the chain on the door, safe meant I can go on doing what I do. To the boy on the BMX weaving through traffic, safe meant interesting without consequence. To the elderly man whose wife has brittle bones, safe meant if we go to the grocery, will someone else's panic trample us? We were told to say, we are monitoring the situation. Avoid speculation. Avoid congregating in public places for viewing. That last part made me smile against my will. It assumed these were fireworks. That night, the words didn't wait until afternoon. They came at dark, when the neighborhood lights clicked on one by one like a careful row of matches. I had 2 windows open because the house held onto heat like it owned it. The curtains moved sideways enough to trip the corner of a receipt ID missed and send it skittering off the table into the chair seat. I stood to catch it, silly in how quick my hand went, as if my pay depended on this scrap. Through the window, I could see the piece of sky above the laundry where everyone S-lines crisscrossed like Cartier's cradle. The letters glowed low, not neon, not fire. They had the color of those old exit signs that use a chemical and not electricity, green that isn't in any grass you've ever seen. Do not pretend, they said. Somebody in the building laughed at a show. A baby made that serious breath before it cries, and then did not. I went to the sink and let the cold tap run until it wasn't warm. The hose outside banged twice in the wall, a hollow sound like someone knocking from the wrong side. I filled a glass and drank, and it felt like I'd eaten dirt. That was in my head. The water tested fine the next day and the next. You can convince your tongue of rot if you look at a thing too long. By the 3rd day, the county sent out a bulletin. Advisories have a smell to them even through email. You can tell who wrote them by the verbs. The county uses avoid, refrain, limit. The town uses be cautious, remain aware. Neither set means anything, but you feel safer having a list of words around you. This one asked residents to remain indoors after evening, to avoid gathering, to report any hazards. Hazards wasn't defined. That was good politics. It kept everything on the table without naming any one thing that might be liable. They closed the library early. They cancelled the farmer's market that would have been on Saturday morning by the bank, the one with cucumbers and regrettable jewelry. The mill sounded louder, like they'd cranked some belt-tighter to answer for everyone else going quiet. The church posted that they meet on the lawn, if weather permitted, and no sky phenomena occurred. Everyone called it that to make it smaller, like if you can name it in 2 words, it fits in a drawer. The school sent a robocall about movie night being moved to the gym. I pictured the projector fighting the polished floor, a square of light lunging at a stripe of gloss and skewing. I still worked, because work is a way to keep the walls from closing. I replaced 2 sections of guardrail up on County 5, where someone had kissed it with a quarter panel the night before. The old rail carried a smear of color and a few threads that looked like cotton and were fibers that will outlast every child in this town. I set cones, waited the right beats to step into the lane, unbolted bolts that needed oil and should have gotten it last spring. While I worked, the scanner on my hip hissed and clicked. A man phoned about his neighbor burning brush too close to his shed. A woman reported a light that had stayed green too long. She didn't like what that meant. A kid wanted to know if we made the sky do it, and if so, could we write his name next? At the hardware, late afternoon, the overhead fans shuffled the smell of mulch with fertilizer and old cardboard. I bought a new pair of gloves because the right thumb on mine split, and when you tug split leather, it just becomes more honest about itself. The woman at the register gave me a sad smile, like she understood something about me that I hadn't told her. People did that more now. They looked at one another like we were all puzzles they were almost finished with. She counted back my change, although the display told her, a habit or a kindness you don't see much. As she did, the little bar scanner at her elbow beeped a beat I knew from a long time ago, the way the library used to sound when you checked out a stack. It had that nostalgia to it. The beep came sharp, then softer, then sharp, like it couldn't decide on confidence. It took me a second to realize she wasn't scanning anything. The red light lay across the counter like a small fence, and it pulsed twice, 3 times, and seemed to look at me. In that flash, the sky wrote again through the front windows, washed out in the late glare but present. "I know the thing you didn't say," it spelled, which is a meaner sentence than you expect from clouds. I walked home with the bag swinging, and the world felt hosed down, cleaner than it should, like how places look right after a parade when you pick the litter and ignore the tired. The apartment had the smell of coffee from that morning, chaffed and comfortable. I set the bag on the table and stood, forgetting whatever it is you think about when your body does its carry and unlock and carry again without trouble. When my hands don't have work, they look bigger than they are. You notice them. That's not good, or not for me, or not for... I haven't told you yet about the thing I didn't say. That's polite of me and cowardly. When a person walks away from a marriage, there's always a story they let the town have. Mine was simple. We wanted different lives. It had some truth in it, the way bumper stickers hold a decent slogan without any instruction on how to live. The part I didn't say isn't dramatic. No affair to photograph, no habit to confess. All the worse for that. It was long and small. It looked like after a wet winter the paint at the bathroom window bubbled, and I pressed it once with my thumb to see if it would flatten, and it didn't. T&I let it be. It looked like leaving a light on in the other room to make a house feel bigger. It looked like measuring bolts in a hardware aisle and not trusting a person waiting at home to know the difference between 1/2 and 3/8. It looked like the night my father died and I didn't call her from the hospital because there was nothing to be done by anyone, and it would have been an ask for attention I wasn't ready to owe. That is a hard sentence to put down. The sky put it there for me without the details and let me fill them. On the 4th night, the words went from pale green to red. I would have told you before that red is showy and belongs to carnivals and taillights and error messages on a thermostat that lost its mind. This red was a bruise under skin, a dark seethe more than a shine. It bled across the low clouds like there was a fire you couldn't find. The letters rose slow and held. "You cannot hide," they said. A more straightforward sentence. Sometimes the direct ones hurt more. The town moved strange under that color. Curtains didn't close so much as they froze. A man across the way, the one who runs a landscaping crew and drinks a beer against his truck after, set a chair in his doorway and sat with his legs wide and his hands on his knees like a referee waiting to call something unclean. The woman on the 2nd floor, who grows herbs in coffee cans, took every can inside and stacked them on the stove, and then took them back out one by one, like she decided she'd been silly and then decided she hadn't. The alley cat that hates people and all their noise walked children's careful, setting each foot like the concrete might bite. I went to the sink again and ran the tap until you couldn't, to tell the season from the pipe, and drank and tasted copper for no reason a test strip would find. I held the glass against the counter and the rim clicked like a small bell. You can make a ritual out of anything you do twice. The county revised the bulletin the next morning. The words remained calm. The phrases shifted. It added a sentence about limiting unnecessary travel, which is one of those jokes that isn't. Travel is necessary if you've said it is. The grocery stayed open under humming lights. The pharmacist worked with his shoulders higher than the day before, like he'd put on a new shirt that didn't fit. The mill crew kept coming, 3rd shift bleary-eyed and brittle, 2nd shift quiet as a church. Schools postponed a field day someone had planned. I climbed the boom and leaned out to spray an oil stain off sagged asphalt where a delivery truck had seeped, and watched the black crackle and turn rainbow before it ran. Rainbow is pretty and smells like a headache. A town is a machine of small problems. We kept fixing them while the big ones spelled on. I changed out a light at Maple and Saturday, and when the head was off, there was a wasp nest inside with paper walls so fine they looked like a hand had spun sugar and set it there as a joke. The wasps were gone or dead. There was no motion to prove which. I lifted it with 2 fingers and felt its weight like a breath on my palm. Under it was a smear of red the light had not put there, a stutter of words, "cannot hide." The letters were barely a shade deeper than the metal. If you didn't know to look, you would think someone's glove rubbed a pattern. I set the head on, tightened the bolts, watched the light come hot and then swell into steady. If this were a story I got to make easy, I'd say we identified a culprit, a drone, a factory, a rich boy with a bright toy and not enough conscience. We made a call, drew a line, handed out fines. Everyone clapped that embarrassed clap people do when they're grateful and feel silly about it. That's not what happened. The nearest the county came to a reason was a line in the paper that said, "Meteorological anomalies remain under review." They called in a professor from inland who wore a hat on the noon news and rubbed his jaw a lot and said words like inversion layer, particulate, stochastic, refracted. He was careful with his qualifiers and looked at the camera like he saw a man behind it who didn't tea like him and could make that known later. He did what scientists who aren't sure do. He said what things weren't. People like it less when you talk that way, but I've always respected it. It's honest to live by subtraction when addition would be more fun. 2 nights after the red, something else changed. Not the words themselves, that came later, but the way we heard them. I was in bed, and the fan clacked in 4 loops that made me think of the way a man clears his throat when he was about to call your name. The windows were shut because the air had turned heavy. Somewhere, a car alarm tried 2 short bleats, then died of embarrassment. It was quiet enough to hear the ice settle in the freezer bin. I don't know what woke me. It wasn't the light of letters. It was the edge of a sound I couldn't place. The closest I can get to telling you is the way a TV whispers through a wall when someone fell asleep with it on. I lay on my back and let my ears climb. The sound wasn't outside and it wasn't inside. It felt like it had set up camp in the seam between. The words didn't speak like a voice. That would have been human and therefore kind. They formed, and the air sort of leaned on their shape, and that leaning had a noise. "We saw," it said. "Then we see. Then we will see." 3 tenses in 2 breaths. I would have laughed if I'd had the wind. When morning came, Eldergrove looked hungover. People set their trash with more care, lines of bags standing straight as teeth. The stoplights cycled slower, or we felt them, as if the seconds between colors had been padded out, the way a bad storyteller adds detail, because it feels like depth. If you stood alone too long in one place, a person would pass and then pass again with no errand and pause, like maybe this was a checkers game, and you were a piece they could jump if you were foolish. The store kept selling what it sells, but folks bought more bleach. Bleach is a comfort to people who like to win small wars against mildew. It's a righteous smell. It says you are trying. I bought a jug and a roll of paper towels the size of my thigh and took them home to a kitchen already very clean. On the 7th day since the first letters, the mayor called a town meeting in the gym because we still do that here and because the church would have been worse optics. The folding chairs went out in lines, legs clacking the polished floor, the squeak like a line of mice. The lights were bright and kind to no one. There were signs on the doors about comportment and civil discussion. A man with a badge stood by the bleachers with his thumbs under his vest, as if he held it all together by pressing at the seams. The town came in groups of 2 and 3, and sat with wasted spaces at the end of rows, like people are afraid of being blocked from the exits. I stood at the back because standing feels like choices. The mayor has a calm voice. Calm voices make me suspicious, but he's always used his for good. He talked about resilience and community and investigations ongoing. The professor from inland spoke again with more caution and more fleece. A mom brought a toddler who dropped a plastic dinosaur and then put it back in his mouth, and his mother let him, because you have to let something go if you want to keep the rest in your hands. People asked questions that sounded like statements, which is how we do it when we want to be seen asking. But we don't believe in any answer that doesn't confirm us. No one said the part I was waiting for. Maybe it's not a thing you say into a mic. Maybe it is too impolite to say aloud that the sentences hurt because we all had something we didn't want written down. We filed out, and I walked home under a sky that behaved. No letters, no hum. The quiet had a weight to it of a different kind. I sat at the table and ran my palm over the wood like there was a map there I could read with my hand. On the corner was a dark ring from a glass set down when I wasn't looking. I rubbed it with my thumb until the skin shone and the ring didn't. The fridge hummed and then didn't tea, and the silence it left drew a line around me large enough to include a chair and a man and a floor. The receipt that had said the words lay under the others, still there if I wanted it. I did not want it. I left it, which is a kind of wanting. What I'm saying is, we learned to live with it. One day followed another. Letters came and went. The sentences rotated like someone shuffled a deck and drew without looking. We see you. Do not pretend. We know what you did. You cannot hide. There were lesser cousins too, ones that said, keep your promises, ones that said, return what you borrowed, ones that said, say it and be done. They were content, as men in bars are, to imply specifics and let you write the rest. The more they wrote, the more our routines bent. Men who mow their small perfect squares let the lines wobble. Women who walked the same route each morning went twice around a block and then went home with their heads down, as if walking away from something that kept pace with them. At the grocery, the scanner beeps fell into patterns you could hum along with if you didn't catch yourself. And people started telling on themselves. It wasn't loud at first. It happened where the rooms are small and the words are soft. In the laundromat, a woman said to another without looking, I took the thing from the break room and kept it, and I don't know why. At the pump, a man set the nozzle and said to the air, I told him I got laid off because I couldn't look at him and say I left. In the vestibule at the bank, two teenage girls stood with their elbows touching, and one of them said, I said that about you, and I did not care what it did. The sky didn't answer every confession with some bright absolution. It hung above and let the sound of our own breath be judgment. Maybe that was the worst of it. After a week of this, a new sentence wrote itself at dusk so slow it made my eyes hurt to keep up. We ask for an answer, it said. That one was new in tone, and I felt the room tilt a degree I didn't know existed. Ask, answer, not command, accuse. Ask is worse. It gives you a piece of responsible that makes your bones sing. What answer? I asked the kitchen. To what? The crisper the town kept itself, the more the edges frayed. A barber put a sign in his window that said, No sky talk. A baker put up a charmer chalkboard about pies and then erased it mid-morning and stood with the eraser in his hand like an apology no one took. The mill ran an extra shift and paid cash in small envelopes that made men nod once and not ask questions. A teacher posted an assignment where kids were to write a letter to the sky. The principal took it down by lunchtime and put a smiley face on the board where the paper had been pinned, and the marker squeaked too much, making the eyes. I started taking the long job choices. If there was a task that put me up on a ladder away from talk, I took it. I cleaned the graffiti off underpass supports, even when it was only 2 letters, more shadow than paint. I climbed the back stairs in City Hall to replace bulbs that had burned long ago and were no 1S priority. That stairwell smells like 100 years of paper and damp denim. In the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, there is a window that looks west over the roofs to where the tracks cut the town a notch. I stood and watched the line where the letters usually came, and for the first time I wanted them too, just to have something specific to push against. The window rattled in the frame like teeth. At home, the thing I had not said sat with me at my small table like a second plate. I told myself sentences and rejected them. I made lists of what I could say and waved them to the trash. I fought the air. I arranged my receipts until they lined like shingles. I watched the freezer frost grow in a pattern and scratched it with a butter knife, and it looked for a second like writing, and then looked like scratches. I kept putting off calling my ex-wife, because calls like that ask you to cut off a piece of yourself and pretend it grew back ahead of schedule. I pictured the words I would say and saw the sky print them above all of us and imagined the town craning their necks to read and then looking down at me and saying, "We knew." I hadn't stopped being a coward when I took the municipal job. The letter the sky wanted wasn't mine alone, though I took it that way because I am a selfish animal. The next sequence of nights, the sentences turned personal in a way that wasn't private. They didn't say you. They said a name. The first name written was not mine. It was Benny. There are 6 Bennys in Eldergrove if you are counting by birth certificate, fewer if you are counting by what a person answers to. The letters didn't say last name. People thought first of the one who runs parts at the auto place on the corner because he's the noisiest Benny. The second was the boy who sweeps there on weekends. They both stayed inside. People called one another and asked, "Do you think it is yours?" They did not ask Benny. They asked his wife, his mother, his boss, as if the person named might be last in line for their own explanation. The words were big, and then were gone, and then returned with another name 3 nights later, Ellen. The name after that belonged to a man who'd gone to jail 10 years ago and moved away, and people still said his name like a stone in their mouths. The name after that was a woman who taught kindergarten and wore scarves and would scold you in the grocery if you put a cantaloupe in the wrong bin. When her name lit, the produce aisle went quiet. I wondered when my turn would be written. There are 2 Matts in this town, and I am the one who fixes lights. The other works at the meat counter. I'm not superstitious about consonants, but I heard the sound of the M in the dark and sounded it again until it made no sound. It's a round letter M, like arms around a barrel. I didn't want it. I wanted it. Every night, I went to bed with a kind of prayer, and every morning I woke with its smear still on my mouth. 14 days after the first sentence, the sky wrote my name. Not flat, not in that way a plane drags smoke. It rose in a slow reluctance, strokes thick at the start and thinned in the finish, like someone who had to force the bottle to make ink. Matt, it said. I thought it would feel like a knife. It felt like being washed. If you have stood under a shower after a long, hot day of gravel, you know that shock. Your skin becomes its own thing and you live just under it for a while. The letters held, and I looked left and right like someone next to me might say, "I see you, friend." No one did. They were inside with curtains that did not quite close. I didn't go out. I sat in the chair with the receipt pile and my new gloves soft and smelling of grease hide and the bleach bottle under the sink, like a talisman I'd lost belief in. The fridge hummed, and a second later the hum echoed back from the apartment upstairs, where the neighbor S fridge answered. And the overlap made a slow beat that lined up with the pulse in my ears. I held the armrests as if a plane had dipped. The letters thinned, and none came to replace them, and I sat without the courage to stand and without the mercy to lie flat and be no one. The phone rang. It isn't a fancy phone. It made its sound, and I watched it as if watching would quiet it. When I picked up, the voice wasn't one I know well. It was Tara from Zoning, who had never called me at home. "I'm not supposed to have this number," she said, which is what people say when they got it through a friend they don't want you to ask about. I wanted to say, "Are you okay?" "I am breathing," I said. "That can be enough for a day," she said. They posted a list, the county. If your name shows, you can go to City Hall and talk to someone. "What about?" I said, and then I didn't want to finish a sentence that made me a petition. "About whatever," she said. "God, I'm making it worse. They're calling it a response center. Like a disaster," I said. "I guess," she said. "I don't know if it's helping. Benny went in and came out, and he looked like he'd been asked to drive to the coast and come back without stopping." "What is any one of us supposed to say?" I said. I don't know, she said. I thought of calling you because yesterday I took a stapler from the front desk and put it in my drawer, and I don't know why. I put it back this morning and didn't say anything. I wanted to say that to someone, and you are a person. I am, I said, and the words felt like one of those bridges on the highway that look straight until you drive on them, and the deck shifts a little under your tires and you realize someone else maintains them for you while you pretend it is all fine. We didn't say anything else very useful. She told me about a cat that has been walking along the top of the chain link fence around City Hall and how it knows where the posts are because it puts its feet down just before the stretch and waits, then steps, as if it sees what we don't. She didn't tell me to go to the response center. I didn't tell her I would. After she hung up, the room felt like it had been crowded and then cleared, and the air had to resettle. I didn't go that day. I went the next. I woke with the sense you get when you've been not doing a thing so long that not doing it becomes painful. I shaved and cut my chin like a teenager and pressed a square of paper to the spot and watched the blood make a map there. I put on a clean shirt, which is not something anyone who works with oil does at noon unless they are making himself into a shape people can accept. I walked to City Hall because driving felt like cowardice and because a man who fixes streets should put his shoes on them sometimes. The flag by the door lifted in a small wind and then fell like it regretted the effort. Inside, the air smelled like paper and patience. There were chairs in the lobby and signs made in a hurry but with care. Response, they said, with arrows. The hash of taped lines on the floor guided you like a trick flight for pigeons. A woman at a folding table looked up and smiled the practiced way a person does when they wish about to be asked more than they can give. I typed my name on a pad, used a stylus that had somebody else's teeth marks near the cap. A man in a soft jacket called Matt, in a voice like a piece of glass, rolled in sand first, and he led me into a small room with a fan that wasn't on. He sat and folded his hands, and I sat and unfolded mine, and we breathed. I don't have answers, he said. If I did, I wouldn't be in this room. Then why are we here? I said without heat. I didn't have enough left for heat. We were told. He stopped and lifted his palms like they waited for rain. We were told to collect responses, not to prescribe them. People want to talk, or they think they should. They used a lot of words when they told us, but it amounted to that. Who told you? I said. County, he said. State, the professor, the sky, I said, and he smiled because you have to when a man says the one thing that makes you both ridiculous. What is your response? He said after a small silence. To what? To being seen. The way he said seen made me think of those school pictures where you stand on risers and the gym smells like lacquer and kids are heat and you're in the front row because you're short and you don't want to smile because you have a tooth that looks wrong to you and the person behind the camera tells you to say a word you don't like. To be seen is not always to be held. Sometimes it is to be pinned. I left someone because I didn't want to keep being the one who speaks and then either apologizes or doubles down, I said. I left quiet. It wasn't nice. I made a story that left out parts where I was selfish. I didn't return tools I borrowed because returning them would have meant admitting I needed them in the first place. I pretended that forgetting was a neutral act. When my father died, I didn't tell the person who would have kept me company because company felt like a thing I'd owe later. I'm not as brave as the jobs I choose make me look. I'm better at emergency than I am at love. I don't know if this is what you want. He didn't write. There was no clipboard. That made me angry and relieved in the same motion. Is that a response? He said. It is words, I said, and my throat hurt because I had used it for something other than lies. Does it change anything? He said. Maybe not, I said. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it is not for changing anything. Maybe it is for admitting there are things that you can repair with a torque spec and an extra washer. We sat another minute. He thanked me for coming in the way people thank donors. I left with a small paper that said I had attended and contributed. It looked like a raffle ticket. It made me want to throw up. Outside, the sky behaved. The words took the night off, as if to let us hear the echo of our own talking. I went home, and I called my ex-wife, and I told her the short version of the thing. She listened with the quiet, a well person gives a sick one. We did not become anything after that, and it was good. I slept with the fan off and the room hot and my chest not. The next day, the sky wrote something new. It wrote a long sentence that used commas and one clause, and then another, the way a person who writes on chalkboards does when they forgot the end, and add it as an afterthought. We ask that you bring what is yours into the open and set it where it can be known, it said. We argued with it. On the town page, people posted ideas like they were recipes. Leave objects on your porch, leave letters, leave a thing that represents the thing. A woman suggested a box in front of City Hall, like Lost and Found. A teenager with mirth in him suggested we all put our diaries on our roofs and see if they get rained on. Someone set a cardboard box with a sign that said, Truths, in front of the library. 2 hours later, the wind took it and wedged it under a truck tire in the lot, and 3 slips of paper stuck to the gutter, and we ran the hose and watched them slither into the drain. There was a satisfaction in that. Some truth should go down and not be read by neighbors with soft hands. The sky did not clarify. It doesn't help like that. It writes a sentence and lets you mess it up. That evening I found myself at the maintenance garage, standing in front of the pegboard where we hang keys and cords and tags. The board is my favorite kind of organized. The outlines of the tools are painted on, so you know where each one belongs. There is comfort in seeing a profile and making the thing that matches it slide into place. A cord reel clicked as it wound itself a little, like something small satisfied. I looked at the outlines of the wrenches and the blank where the stubby screwdriver should be, and I felt something like mercy, and I removed from my pocket a stubby screwdriver that had lived in my coveralls for a year. I hadn't stolen it. That's what I would have said if asked. I had borrowed it and not brought it back because it fit my hand in a way that justified quiet theft. I set it in its outline, red handle to red paint, and the room felt larger. That would be a neat ending. That would be the point where I say, we all did small things, and the sky was satisfied and went to find some other town with its index finger out. But that's not the world we got. 3 mornings later, the letters didn't spell words. They spelled numbers. Not numbers written as figures, but the shape of count itself, old as fingers. People stood in their doorways and read the sequence the way you read a recipe. First, then. The numbers weren't to count days, though that's what everyone liked to think. The numbers corresponded to addresses. You could tell because the first set of numbers matched the post office, and the second set matched the library, and the third set matched an empty lot on Elm that used to hold a house and now holds a square of crabgrass and a pad of concrete, like a foundation waiting for a story. After each number, a second line came, short and small. Bring it. That's all. Bring it. At 11 in the morning, people began to carry things to the places. At the post office, a woman set down a stack of letters she had never mailed. At the library, a man put a book on the step and walked and turned again, like he expected to be chased. At the empty lot, 3 kids rolled a tire that had lived under a porch and left it wobbling on its edge until it fell and grinned its metal mouth at the sky. The professor came down and watched without taking notes, his hands deep in his jacket as if to keep himself from trying to shape it. We made small piles and stood back and looked at them like offerings, and the sky did not change. We stayed until we needed sandwiches, and then we went. The list grew. Every morning we would learn a place. Some were municipal, some were private in a way that made it unkind. An old woman lived alone in a house with a porch swing, and the numbers wrote her little street. And at lunch 30 people lined her walk and held in their hands small items: a thimble, a photograph, a ring wrapped in cotton, a toy car with a wheel missing. The woman smiled in a way that made you hate yourself for looking. She set out lemonade in paper cups. The heat pressed on us, and the ice in the cups made a sound like rain. Later we learned that after we left, someone stole half a dozen of the objects while she was inside washing the pitcher. The sky did not punish that we know. Maybe it did, and we didn't see how. Maybe that's worse. When the numbers wrote the mill, no one brought anything. They stood with their arms crossed and watched and turned their faces up like asking for sun. The mill manager came out and closed the gates, and the gate chain clinked a click I could feel in my tongue. The sky didn't insist. It wrote the next number and then the next. A week into numbers, people didn't talk to one another in sentences. They used gestures, nods, their mouths moved, but the words were careful things, not for show. I stopped going to the garage in the mornings and went in the afternoons when most folks hid at home and listened to their refrigerators and the directions their receipts leaned. I would take a mop and make the empty floor into lines and push the water to the drain a certain way and feel like I'd written something that I could erase. I am not a man who asks to be seen. I fix lights. The night it ended, no, ended is a lie. The night it changed, the sky bled red again, deeper like what comes through gauze when you don't take a wound seriously enough. The words flared and then softened. The sound of them was there, a hum like bees far, and an electric whine near and a throb under your bones that made you feel like you were out of step with your own walk. The letters wrote a sentence that no one wanted. We found nothing, it said. We found not enough. We will look somewhere else. The phrasing hurt, not because we had failed an exam, because we had not satisfied a thing that wasn't ours, and yet our bodies acted like we'd been weighed and laughed at. The lights in houses went out not because people chose dark, but because breakers flipped. The stoplights blinked yellow where they could, bright red where they couldn't. The mill wine rose and then cut, and when it cut, it left a hole you could fit a fist into and feel around and not touch bottom. After, the lines at the grocery shrank to nothing and then grew long again and then sank. The church threw open its doors, and 3 people came and sat far apart and looked at the ceiling. The response center closed. The professor went back inland and took his tenses with him. The mayor gave a speech and used a word like regroup, and I wanted to give him my chair. Some people left town, not in a hurry, not with the urgency of a disaster film. They made lists and folded towels and watered plants they gave to neighbors who stood behind their screens and nodded. They put out silly things on the curb they didn't want, and other people took them because things are comfort when you cannot hold certainty in your hands. It wasn't a flight, and it wasn't a trickle. It was the slow rebalancing of a room when a man stands. You do not feel the air move until you slip your hand up and the skin between your thumb and finger catches a colder seam. I didn't leave. It wasn't bravery so much as stubborn geography. I was born where the creek bends near the standpipe and the train whistles sound like children imitating ghosts. There are places you can go and be a person no one knows, and there is a cost to that I don't have the wallet for. I kept working. The tower hum returned to something like itself. The ladders still pinched. The bolts still froze in winter, which was coming. The sky behaved like a thing you can count on to behave. When it rained, it rained. When it stopped, it stopped. The messages didn't come again. They left their stain on everything, and then they were done with us. If there was a purpose, it lay outside the town limits and followed a different road. We were a page in a binder, not a book. There is a terrible freedom in that. Weeks later, at night, when the town let itself sleep out of boredom, I climbed the tower with the habit of a man who needs height to think. I stood with my hands on the rail, and the wind made my ears ache, and the lights of Eldergrove lay out in their poor neatness. I said a sentence I had not said before. I said, "If seeing me changes nothing, you can have the rest." The sky did not answer. The only sound was the low, convex hum of a substation far east, and the breath of highway like a slow animal. My hands felt large. My mouth tasted like old pennies and coffee. The tower vibrated in a note that had always been there and always will be. I climbed down and didn't tell anyone what I'd said. The receipts on my table still inclined their favorite direction. The fridge learned a new rhythm, and I learned to love it. Do I think the sky accused the right town? It wasn't about right. Do I miss the letters? In a way that makes me ashamed, yes. People say they want quiet until quiet comes. Then they would give a hand to hear an old noise again. The world held its breath for 2 weeks and let it out, and our lungs learned a different size. When I drive down Main and catch the greens in sequence, I feel a small prize like a childish S sticker on my jacket. When I wait 3 reds in a row, I put my hands on the wheel and say, "I am seen," and then I laugh and I pull forward when it is my turn. In my kitchen, the bleach sits under the sink and smells like righteousness even with the cap screwed down tight. The stubby screwdriver sits in its outline in the garage, waiting for a hand that fits it. In my pocket there is sometimes a coin I don't remember taking from the dresser. When I find it, I put it in the cup by the sink and listen to the sound it makes against the ceramic, which is a small church bell if you let it be. The fan clacks, the ice settles, the receipts incline, the hose in the wall knocks twice, somewhere a barcode beeps 3 times and then stops. The sky changed how it looks to me. There are still days, heavy before rain, when the clouds lay low and their underbellies are dark as the hands of men who work steel. On those days, all skies are sentences about to be written. And I keep my head down because most things can be fixed with a wrench if you are sober and gentle, and because there are the other things which cannot. When people ask me, and they do sometimes when they are brave enough to admit their curiosity and rude enough to name it, "What did it say to you?" I tell them nothing different than it told everyone else. They hate that answer. Everyone thinks they were more singled out than their neighbor, and maybe that's human, and maybe it's a rot. If they push, I say, it asked for an answer, and I gave it the only one I had. If they push more, I tell them about the tower and the wind and the song of metal and the way a town at night lays itself across the earth like a patient. The rest I keep. I still keep things. A screw in my pocket, a phrase that works, the names of streets no one uses. And on clear nights when the sky is nothing but black felt and pinholes, I step outside and feel a fear that is like a lover, unwanted and familiar. I look up once, quick, like a man who hears his name in a crowd and refuses to turn. If there were words, I think I would read them and then go in and set my cup in the sink and rinse it and put it down upside down, as if that could keep dust from finding it. If there were words, I would read mine, and then I'd read yours too, and I wouldn't tell you. Maybe that's what I learned. Maybe that's the small sting I keep under my tongue instead of a prayer. The town will say it is over. The paper will run a retrospective around the anniversary if the editor keeps his job and there is a page to fill. People will say, "Remember when the sky spoke," as if it were a trick at a fair that returns every other July and brings a smell of popcorn and a rash of stings. We will live the rest of our days in the gravity of it, and the gravity will feel like what our parents meant when they said, "Mind your own." And we will, and we won't. When I lie down at night, I count the seconds between the compressor clicking on and the moment the hum settles into a pitch I can fall asleep to. I count them in words, not figures, because words have weight that can hold a man down or keep him from floating off. On the nights when sleep hesitates, I whisper to the ceiling in a voice I never use for anyone and say, "I see you." And in that exchange, if you can call it that, there is enough, not plenty, but enough. The rest is the kind of quiet a town keeps when it still has lights to replace and valves to bleed. and a long list of streets that need what the sign calls attention, which is to say love with a torque spec. The sky is a ceiling that is not ours. Our part is floors. I still stand under stoplights now, and then the old heads, the ones that never got swapped out for the bright cheap ones, and I wait for green because that is the color of grace, even if you don't to believe in any that were made by men and timers. I look at the little lenses, and they look back at me the way inanimate things look, with patience and no opinion. When it goes, I go. When it doesn't, I wait. That is a life. That and the sound of a hose knocking in the wall like a neighbor who forgot his key and hopes you are home. After the letters quit, Eldergrove turned brittle. You could feel it in the way a door closed. People stopped letting doors fall into themselves. They guided them by the knob and set the latch as if a house needed coaxing. That first week, without words, the sounds that had filled the gaps lifted their heads and asked to be counted. The stoplights ticked somewhere in their stomachs. The vending machine at City Hall clunked a soda down its plastic track with a small apology. The town cut the response center to half hours, then nothing. They stacked the clipboards and coiled the tape and wheeled one of those grey carts into the corner and draped it with a sheet like a body at the end of a long day. I picked up another set of keys, basement access, evidence cages, archive doors. With the response center gone, the objects people had brought, the envelopes, the rings wrapped in cotton, the plastic tyrannosaur with one leg glued on, had no place. I was told to carry them down, shelf them, catalogue only what had a name on it. A policy came from somewhere. Policies always do. The basement in City Hall never wanted company. It smelled like a wet book left in a car. I ran the dehumidifiers until the buckets were too heavy for one hand, and I learned to carry them against my chest like a sleepy child. The fluorescent in the first row ticked and steadied, then did that little high-pitched whine that means the ballast will die on a day you need it to live. I made a note. The evidence cage had that wire diamond pattern that makes you feel like you are being seen through a sieve. I set boxes on shelves and tried not to look into them. Looking made you choose. Choosing made you think you had authority. Authority meant owning what came next. In the third box was a small envelope with my name on it, not a typed label, pen, no return. I set it on the work table and stared at it the way a man stares at a low fire, trying to accept that it will burn in the way it wants and not in the way you planned. I finished shelving. I swept around my own boots. The envelope waited. I opened it with the blunt of a box cutter because I am who I am. Inside were two things. One was a carbon copy of a work ticket from years back when I was new and more careful with pens. I'd written a note about a hall light in a rental 3 streets over, flicker under load, check neutral, probably a loose wire nut. On the back of the paper, faint, the way heat leaves a handprint on metal, were the letters, "We see you still." The second thing was a tiny washer with a sharp burr on one edge, the kind that cuts you only after it slides. It was like being handed your own orbit back. I returned the envelope to the box. I closed the cage and checked the lock twice. I told myself no story about who put it there. I didn't want to assign that kind of generosity or that kind of malice to anyone I'd have to see at the grocery. Upstairs, Tara had a stack of signs she couldn't bring herself to recycle. She held one up and read it without moving her lips, and then set it face down like a mirror you don't want to catch yourself in. "I still write them out of habit," she said. "Little rules that make people feel like they have a law to lean on." "It helps some," I said. "I know," she said, but the way she said it made me think of how people say, "It's fine," when they've decided it won't be, but they were tired of arguing with the air. At night, without letters, the sky became a ceiling again, not ours, as always. The quiet had a way of crawling into the walls. It found new paths. It hummed through the refrigerator coils like a wire tuned to a note I couldn't name. I started hearing a chorus of compressors, not just mine, upstairs, next door, across the alley. When they all clicked on in a sequence, the room changed pressure, a small lift in the ears, and I would find myself holding my breath like I was waiting for a sentence. The set of a stoplight 3 blocks over is a kind of heartbeat. I could feel it if I stood still and let my chest match it. It made a person wonder if the messages had gone into the machines we live with. It made a person feel lucky if they could forget that thought for an hour. The county shut down the last of the response desks on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, I was sent over to the roof of City Hall to check a leak by the elevator penthouse. The stairs to the roof are narrow enough that you turn your shoulders sideways without meaning to. The door at the top is heavy and sticks. You push your hip against it and it gives like an old friend who came over for coffee and stayed through lunch. The roof is a tar and pea gravel job, grit under boots, tar soft where the sun heats it. People don't go up there unless they have to. Pigeons do. The parapet catches their talk and the wind smears it. Along the south edge, near the place where the cat walks the chain link when she comes across from the library roof, there was a line in the rust at the parapet cap. Not written, not laid. The rain had landed and the run had found the low spots, and those spots made letters where the iron bled. We keep what is named, it said low, the way watermarks always talk. I stood with my hands on my belt and pretended to look at the drain cups, which were fine, and the flashing, which would hold until winter, and kept my eyes on the rust, only in the edges, as if direct stare would make it shy. The sentence wasn't for me and was exactly for me. It meant nothing and everything, which is how most of the town S sentences go, even when they aren't a T in the sky. I thought about the box downstairs, its little washer, the carbon copy with my hand on it. I thought about how a name on a thing is a leash, unless it is a tie that keeps you from floating. They want to incinerate the stuff, Tara said later, when I pretended to be there for gaskets. Policy from up the hill. Reduce accumulation. When? I said. End of week, she said. We'll call it pruning. That's the word they gave me. Pruning's when you want better fruit, I said. I don't think they thought that far, she said, and then she laughed in a sound like a cough. They never do. They put me on the transfer because I have the truck and the back that still cooperates if I ask nice. The transfer station is its own weather. Diesel mixed with the sweet of rotted orange peel, heat from the compactors, a chill that comes up from the pit like a basement that learned to breathe. The floor is slick in places you wouldn't guess, and grit in places you assume smooth. A forklift beeped in reverse, the long, tired beep of a machine that has done this yesterday and will do it tomorrow, until a bearing says no. The keypad at the scale house chirps with the same 2-note phrase every truck, like a bird that learned one joke and won't stop telling it. When the conveyor runs, it makes a prayer wheel hush. The incinerator door shivers in its frame when it shuts. Soft thunder, a steel nudge you feel in your knees before your ears. We loaded the city's boxes onto a wooden pallet and wrapped it tight with plastic. The plastic yells when you pull it from the roll. We wrote on a tag with a Sharpie, "Municipal Collection." I wheeled it, shoulders open across the floor, my boots asking questions of every small puddle. When the pallet met the ramp edge, it jerked, and my hands remembered the old muscle from a time when I moved friends with couches and told myself that counted as showing up. The pallet took the incline, and the conveyor pulled at the plastic, and the heat pushed its palm into the hair on my arms. As the load slid into the mouth, the steam that burped out rose and turned in the halogen glare and curled into shapes I did not want to read, and I read them anyway. Keep warm, it said. Keep close. Return later. A thing that wants you to tend it is dangerous if you don't want a child. I stood with my mouth open like a man who can't place a smell. The heat took the words and made them only air again. I shut the door. The door's latch settled with a second click like a throat swallowing. I stood a minute more. The man on the forklift lifted his hand and did that head tilt that means what? And I did the hand wave that means nothing, and that was the truth, and not. On my way out, a scrap fell away from the pallet as if it had been waiting through the entire ride. It was not an envelope, it was a small brass key, the kind you use on hose bibs when someone took the handle off because they were tired of teenagers stealing water at midnight. It had the right heft and the right lack of teeth. The shaft had a little cross hole where you put a string if you are the sort who thinks ahead. I picked it up and rolled it in my palm and felt that little burr you sometimes get at the edges when the blank was too fast through the grinding wheel. I didn't want it. That's exactly why I put it in my pocket. I started bringing things back to where their outlines lived. A round head screw found the hole in the side of the breaker panel where the cover flapped when you opened it. A missing valve cap returned to the stem of the self-important airline behind the paint cabinet. A bent hanger slid back on its peg in the locker room, and the shape on the wall swallowed it with a sigh I made up. No one asked. Some men see only what needs fixing, others see the list. I raised the list and lowered it, and the town kept finding its quiet. In the middle of all this, the county passed a rule with a soft name and a stiff spine, the Orderly Streets Act, which made leaving objects outside a fine and made collecting them a kindness backed by code. I drove the pickup through neighborhoods and hoisted the boxes people left for the sky long after the sky had stopped reading. I took them to the station and watched the mouth take them. The copy machine at City Hall printed the notices with a little stutter in the top left corner, like a nervous laugh. Tara put the notices under doors with a face I started to think of as a second skin. People said thank you to me in the tone of voice you use when a man carries out your old fridge and you feel guilty and grateful together. One afternoon, the mayor asked if my team could go up the tower to check the lightning rod because the insurance man asked, and the insurance man has a way of making everyone act as if fear could be written down and covered for a price. The rod stood sharp against a sky that had decided to behave with a hint that maybe it would change its mind. The wind came across from the low hills with the smell of hot pine. I clipped onto the cable and climbed. The rungs had polished spots where hands go. Halfway up, the tower began its old note in my bones again, that long, low tone that registers more in jaw than ear. The hatch hinge squealed and then remembered itself. The catwalk rolled under my weight and then forgave me. I checked the bonds on the rod. They were tight. The wire traced down the side in its loop, proper, the way a man with a code book means proper. I stood with a wrench in my hand and thought about tightening the thing that already held, because sometimes the motion of tightening is a comfort a man needs to borrow. The clouds had a belly to them again. No color, but a hint of it, like an old bruise that forgot which story it belonged to. The wind made my shirt slap against my ribs. I looked down, and the houses had small roofs for small lives, and big roofs for lives a person pretends are larger. Under my boots, in that little spot where the paint rubs thin at the corner of the hatch, the rain had left an alphabet of rust, and when the gust came, the spots connected and spelled, "Bring the rest." I set the wrench down. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. I had not decided anything. The key was a convenience to something I hadn't named. I turned and set it on the hatch lid, where the paint flaked and the steel showed. The key stuck there as if set on a magnet, though there isn't one. I slid it with a finger, and it resisted like a cat who doesn't want to give up a lap. I lifted the lid. The smell of the tank came up, cold and iron, and a little like old coins. The water's surface lay like a sheet in the dark, big and manageable, only if you've never had to lift one alone. "Here," I said to no one, and not softly. "Here's all I have." My voice hit the space and traveled and softened toward the far curve. I don't romanticize acoustics, but a tank like that makes a man hear himself in a way you don't get to in kitchens and hallways. The key slid a quarter-inch on the steel, and I put it inside on the lip, and it clung like a thing that recognized home. I lay on my stomach and put my head as close to the hole as felt smart, and the water said nothing, then changed, not in color, not in smell, in the way it lay against the light. Ripples formed, slow, as if a fish far below turned. The ripples found one another. The lines crossed, not random. If you've ever watched a shop fan make a paper ribbon dance the way the air gives and the ribbon accepts, and there's a pattern that belongs to neither but is born between them, you know the look. The ripples met the light from the hatch, and the light made the ripples into strokes I could read. Names came up, not mine. I mouth-read them in a hush even when my mouth didn't move. I saw the barber's given name, not the one on his window. I saw a girl I remember from a bus stop when I was a kid. A girl who would open her lunch bag and smell inside and laugh. I saw the 3 Bennies at once, and the 2 Ellens, and a name I didn't know and knew anyway because it meant trouble when said in a crowded room. The water wrote like that for a long minute, and then the names thinned, and there were numbers, not addresses this time, but counts. And then the counts dissolved, because numbers don't like water unless you carve them somewhere a blade can hold. Behind me, the tower sang its note. Below me, the water moved like a chest. Far off, on the edge of town, the substation made its low insect drone that you only notice when someone mentions it and then cannot unhear. And there came a moment where all the fridges in my part of Eldergrove clicked on at once, and the tap in my downstairs neighbor Say's bathroom coughed, and the stoplight at 16th went stubborn yellow for longer than that program says it should. It felt like lining up a bolt that had been cross-threaded and then finding the bite. The town settled into a beat. I closed the hatch and the key hung where I left it. I didn't take it back. Climbing down, I felt my knees for their complaints and my hands for the old electric tingle you get when you work near things that hum. On the ground, the grass around the tower base had lines in it that weren't mower paths, as if people had paced there when I wasn't, as if everyone had their own circle to wear thin. I locked the gate. The padlock clicked in a tone I hadn't heard before and liked very much and pretended not to. I walked home, like a man who had left his wallet somewhere on purpose. After that, the town got clever again. Not with words, with arrangements. Things started finding their places without human hands, in a way that made me want to give credit to a wind. The collection of mugs in my cupboard, never proud, turned themselves so all the handles faced the same way. The stack of receipts on my table leaned left and then corrected right, and then one morning laid themselves in descending order by date in a trick I would have accused a person of, if any person had been there. A child's bicycle left out rolled itself an inch at a time through a day until it nested against the porch step, as if storing itself for winter. The library returned books cart filled and emptied in a pattern the staff couldn't reproduce on paper later when they tried. In the alley, the hoses in their boxes knocked twice in the walls when I walked past. Not at night, not for others. I'm not special. I was just there. The county closed the incinerator for 3 days to service the door, and when the door was open and the mouth was quiet, the air at the station was clearer than it had ever been, and you could smell hay from somewhere far, which made the men squint like farmers remembering a field. The mill took a day to go dark to fix a belt that had been complaining, and when it went quiet for that day, the town heard itself breathing and flinched. The grocery's barcode scanner had learned a different beep from its own past. 3 short, 1 long, then nothing. As if spelling in a code only machines want to recall. Tara told me she was leaving town over a paper cup one afternoon. She sat on the edge of the work table in the garage and drank water and turned the empty in her hands like a wheel. "I want to live somewhere the sky minds its own," she said, then made a face at her own sentence. "Or somewhere I can lie to myself better than here." "Where?" I said. "Not far," she said. "If I say far, I won't go at all. My mother says I should stay because she believes in muscle memory. I told her I don't trust any muscle I can't see." "We'll need new keys," I said, because it is easier to talk about keys. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You always do with objects. With people you take a few days longer." She set the cup on the counter upside down, and a ring of water gathered under it like a word. She didn't wipe it up. After she left, I lifted the cup and the water had turned itself into a shape I refused to name. "I put the cup in the trash because sometimes you fight an enemy you can step over," she went. The town absorbed her departure the way dirt absorbs a shovel mark, ugly when new, then part of the grammar of a yard. Her office got quiet. The signs in the closet leaned against one another like old men at a parade. Someone new came in and sat in her chair and crossed their ankles and stared at the corkboard like it would confess. The boxes of offerings dwindled because there were fewer offerings. The ordnance did its bored work. People took to writing their sentences in notebooks they kept under mattresses, and the sky didn't care, because the sky had stopped listening, or had never listened in the way we mean that word. The cat still walked the chain link and paused at the posts and waited, and then stepped. I kept the town's small air moving with fans. I changed a gasket on a hydrant that weeps when the day is just the right heat. I bled the tower when the grit spoke. I went home and put my cup in the sink and turned it upside down. The quiet didn't break. It wrinkled. On a night in late fall, there was a leaf rot to the air, a cold that carried fresh sawdust from someone as inexact trimming. The town as undersounds lined up again, the fridges, the substation, the stoplights, the heaters breathing in their ducts. I woke in bed and heard the balance and thought of the tank S water making a skin for us. And I felt a mean thing I'm not proud of. Satisfaction at being part of a machine which is safer than being a man. I went to the garage before dawn and turned on the lights, and the fluorescents took their little while to decide. In that half moment, a shadow wrote itself across the concrete like a hose laid down, and the shadow made a sentence that had no letters, only intent. "Seen," it said, "not we see you, not do not pretend, not bring it, seen." The fan over the parts bins turned once without power and stopped, as if acknowledging a salute. The fridge clicked. The receipt pile at home probably inclined, and then righted, and then accepted the position it likes. We put out cones where the pavement fails. We stand under dead heads and lift new ones and make them live. We patch fences. We bleed tanks that want talking. We lift boxes and move them in and then out and say a word to ourselves when the door takes our shoulder on the way through. The sky will do as it wants. I have my part. Once on a Sunday, I drove out to where the highway lifts on pillars and watched as a flock of starlings reassembled from pieces of itself, a knitted dark, held and broken and held again by an intelligence the human in me wanted to call beautiful, until I remembered that beauty is a word for comfort, and that wasn't what I felt. They folded and rose and took a shape that hinted at a sentence, and then gave it up and became only birds again. A boy in a back seat rolled down a window as his mother drove past and shouted something joyful and vague. The words scattered against the air and fell around me like the sound of receipts being set down. I stood with my hands in my pockets and the brass key not in one because I'd left it where it belonged, and I felt the ache in my jaw that is the tower singing, and I went home. On my kitchen counter, there are sometimes squares of dull light, where the afternoon finds its way through the blinds that no arrangement can argue with. In one of those squares, once I lifted my cup, and the light under it was not light, but the residue of breath from a person who had been there and wasn't a tea anymore. And in that residue, I could have written a name with one finger, and I didn't. I wiped it with my wrist. The hose in the wall knocked twice, then once, which is not a pattern I know. I waited, nothing else knocked. The town's machines found their own beat again and gave it back. If there is an ending here, it lives inside a drawer I did not open and do not plan to. Endings are tidy. We are not that. I go to work. I watch for the colors I'm given. I stand under a red longer than any driver wants to, and I count in words until they line up with the change. I pass the tower and glance up and keep my eyes on the rungs I know by number and refuse to think of them as numbers. There is a sign in the garage I made and didn't hang. It is plain printer paper. It says, "Seen in letters that look like a man with a ruler, tried and got tired." Sometimes I slide it under the blotter on the desk and line up the lower right corner with the edge of the pad. That makes the day move better. Sometimes I put it in my pocket instead and forget it is there and find it at the wash, and it bleeds a little and still says what it says. At night I lie on my back and count the breath between the fridge hum and the return. Not because I am afraid it won't come, but because I like the way the words stack in my mouth to mark the seconds. When the hum comes, I let my jaw unclench. When it doesn't come on time, I stare at the ceiling and say to it, in a voice nobody else has to hear, "You do what you want and I will do what I can." And in the empty between those lines is where the town sleeps now. It is where the town will wake. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.